Hello, and welcome to our podcast episode number 61. He's back from the dead for one last mission of vengeance and redemption. I'm Thomas, and as always, here with me, my friend Timothy. Today, we are going to discuss a film called Mechanic, Resurrection. Mechanic. Resurrection is a 2016 American action thriller film directed by Dennis Gansel and written by Philip Shelby and Tony Mosher, with a story by Shelby and Brian Pittman. It is the sequel to the 2011 film The Mechanic, which was a remake of the 1972 film of the same name. The film stars Jason Statham, Tommy Lee Jones, Jessica Alba, and Michelle Yeoh. First of all, I enjoyed the film, as I generally like action. But, Tim, did you enjoy Mechanic? Resurrection?
Well, Tom, I'll be honest with you, I did enjoy it. It wasn't perfect, but considering that it's an action film, it was quite decent. The plot was engaging enough to keep me intrigued, and the action scenes were well executed. And of course, who can resist a good thriller?
I suppose. But for me, it lacked the necessary tension and suspense that make a good action film, in my opinion. It just felt like one long chase scene after the other without any real stakes or character development.
I can see where you're coming from, Tom. But I still found myself entertained throughout the movie. The chemistry between the main characters was quite good, and I liked the twist at the end.
Twist? There wasn't any twist that I recall. All we got was a predictable storyline with a cliché ending. And don't get me started on the acting. It was just so-so at best.
Well, I did find Jason Statham's performance quite enjoyable. He always manages to bring some life to his roles, and this film was no exception. As for the others, I won't deny that they were a bit lackluster. But I still found myself invested in the story.
To each their own, Timothy. But for me, Mechanic, Resurrection just didn't hit the mark. It had potential, but it fell short in delivering on its promises.
All right, Thomas, fair enough.
We can agree to disagree on this one. So what would you rate it out of 10 stars?
I'd give it a 3 out of 10 stars. It wasn't terrible, but it certainly wasn't worth my time or money.
On the other hand, I enjoyed it enough to give it an 8 out of 10 stars. As I mentioned earlier, it was a decent thriller with some good action scenes and a solid storyline.
Well, that's quite a difference in opinion between us, Timothy. Let's move on to our next topic and see if we can find some common ground there.
Well, as I mentioned before, Thomas, one aspect of the movie I found particularly enjoyable was its plot. The story follows our protagonist, Arthur Bishop, a hitman who is forced out of retirement by his former employer to carry out 3 assassinations in exchange for being allowed to live in peace. Each target has a unique and dangerous skill set that poses a threat to national security.
Yes, I remember that much. But what about it made you enjoy the story so much, Timothy? From my perspective, it just felt like a rehash of the same old tropes we've seen in countless other action movies.
Well, for one thing, I thought the plot had some unexpected twists and turns that kept me guessing until the very end. Additionally, I liked how the characters were portrayed as more than just two-dimensional killers. Arthur Bishop has a backstory and motivations that made him relatable despite his profession. And then there's the character of Gina, who is not your typical damsel in distress, but rather an independent woman with her own agenda.
I guess you have a point there, Timothy. But even so, I still feel like the plot wasn't strong enough to carry the movie on its own merits. It relied too heavily on action sequences and special effects instead of developing its characters or exploring more interesting themes.
That may be true for some people, Tom. But for me, it was an entertaining ride from start to finish that kept my attention throughout. I'm not expecting Oscar-worthy performances or deep philosophical debates from a movie like this. Just a good story with some thrilling moments and mechanic. Resurrection delivered on that front.
All right, Tim. We can agree to disagree on this one, but before we move on to our next topic, let me ask you one question about the film's plot. Why did Arthur Bishop decide to accept his former employer's offer? Was it purely for money, or were there other motivations at play?
That's an interesting question, Thomas. I believe Bishop was motivated by a sense of duty and loyalty to his employer. He also saw it as an opportunity to right some wrongs from his past, which added a layer of complexity to his character. What do you think, Thomas? Why did he accept the offer?
For me, I think it was more about the thrill of the chase and the challenge that comes with taking on such dangerous targets. After all, Bishop is a hitman by trade, so it makes sense for him to enjoy his work. But then again, we might never know for sure since the film doesn't delve too deeply into his motivations.
You could be right about that, Thomas. Either way, I think the plot of Mechanic, Resurrection, was one of its strongest aspects and contributed greatly to my overall enjoyment of the movie.
No.
Are you ready for our next topic, or do you have any more questions regarding the film?
No further questions from me at this time, Timothy. Let's move on and discuss something else.
Well, there are many interesting facts about Mechanic.
Resurrection that might surprise our audience. For instance, did you know that during the underwater fight scene,
Jason Statham actually held his breath for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. That's quite an impressive feat, considering the average person can only hold their breath for less than 2 minutes.
Yes, I had heard about that. But what really surprised me was how much of the movie was shot in Bangkok, Thailand. Apparently, they chose that location because it offered a more exotic backdrop and also provided tax incentives for filming there. It seems like a win-win situation.
Indeed, Thomas, the scenery in Mechanic, Resurrection is quite beautiful and adds to the overall atmosphere of the film. Another interesting trivia I discovered was that Michelle Yeoh, who plays Jessica's character, Anna, was originally supposed to play the role of Gina, but due to scheduling conflicts, she had to step down from the role and was replaced by Jessica Alba.
That's quite an interesting change in casting. I wonder if Michelle Yeoh would have brought a different dynamic to the character of Gina. It's hard to say, but either way, both actresses did a great job with their respective roles.
absolutely, Tom.
Now, let me ask you this. Do you know who was the first choice for the role of Arthur Bishop?
I'm not sure. I think it might have been Sylvester Stallone, but I'm not completely certain about that.
No, you're right, Thomas. Sylvester Stallone was indeed the first choice for the role of Arthur Bishop before it went to Jason Statham. The reason he turned down the opportunity is unknown, but we can only imagine how different the film would have been with a more seasoned actor in that role.
That's quite an interesting piece of trivia, Timothy. I wonder if Sly would have brought a different style to the character. Or perhaps Jason Statham was a better fit after all. Either way, it's fascinating to learn about these behind-the-scenes details that often go unnoticed by audiences.
Indeed, Tom, and there are still many more interesting facts about Mechanic Resurrection out there just waiting to be discovered. But let me ask you a question now. Do you have any other trivia related to the film that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Not off the top of my head, Timothy, but I'm sure we can find some more interesting tidbits as we continue discussing this movie.
Great. Well, then let's keep exploring the world of Mechanic Resurrection and uncover even more hidden gems about this intriguing film.
Well, Tim, we've discussed a lot about the sequel Mechanic, Resurrection, and its differences from the original film. Now, let's dive into some of those differences and what makes them unique. For starters, The original film was directed by Simon West, who has a background in action films like Con Air and Lara Croft Tomb Raider, The Cradle of Life. However, for this sequel we have Dennis Gansel taking over as director, known mostly for his work on thrillers such as The Wave and Before the Fall. This shift in directors could be one reason why the tone and style of Mechanic Resurrection are different from the original. Another significant difference is the setting. The original movie was primarily set in the United States, with a few scenes taking place in Italy. But for this sequel, we have a lot more international locations. A large portion of the film takes place in Bangkok, Thailand, which adds an exotic touch to the storyline and sets it apart from its predecessor. As far as the characters go, both films share the main protagonist, Arthur Bishop, played by Jason Statham. However, there are new additions like Gina, portrayed by Jessica Alba, who has a very different dynamic compared to the other characters in the original film. She's more of a partner for Bishop rather than just a target or a love interest as seen in the first movie. In terms of plot, both films follow a similar premise. A retired hitman is forced out of retirement and must complete a series of assignments to save the people he loves. But the way each story unfolds is quite different. The original film had a more grounded feel with less focus on high-tech gadgets or elaborate stunts. On the other hand, Mechanic Resurrection feels like a more action-packed sequel that takes risks and pushes the boundaries of what we've seen before.
I see, Thomas, there are indeed many differences between these two films. But let me ask you this. Do you think the changes were necessary, or did they detract from the overall enjoyment of the story?
Well, Tim, I do appreciate the international setting and the new characters that were introduced. They added a freshness to the franchise that was lacking in the original film. However, I feel like some of the action sequences were over the top and lacked realism, which took away from my overall experience. On the other hand, there are certain aspects of the original film that I miss in this sequel, namely its grittier tone and the more grounded storyline. But ultimately, both films have their own unique charm and appeal to different audiences.
That's an interesting perspective, Tom. We can certainly agree to disagree on some points, but it's fascinating to see how different people react differently to these two very similar movies. I think that's what makes film discussions so intriguing. There are always multiple perspectives and opinions to consider. Now that we've talked about the differences between the original Mechanic and its sequel, let me ask you this. Do you have any other thoughts or questions related to these films before we move on to our next topic?
Timothy, I'm curious about the character of Gina and how she compares to other female leads in action films. What were your thoughts on her portrayal by Jessica Alba? Do you think she brought something new to the genre, or was she just another pretty face?
That's an interesting question, Thomas. I actually quite enjoyed Jessica Alba's performance as Gina. She brought a level of sophistication and intelligence to the role that we don't often see in female characters of this nature. Her character is not just a damsel in distress or a love interest. She's an equal partner to Arthur Bishop, sharing the same skills and determination. It was refreshing to see a strong female lead who could hold her own against such a formidable opponent like Jason Statham's Arthur Bishop.
Yes, I agree with you there, Timothy. Gina is definitely one of the most intriguing characters in Mechanic. Resurrection and Jessica Alba did an excellent job portraying her. Now let me ask you this. What about the other actors in the film? Do you think they were well cast for their respective roles, or could someone else have played those parts better?
I think overall the casting was spot on. Jason Statham is always a pleasure to watch in an action film, and he did justice to the role of Arthur Bishop. His physicality and charisma made it easy for audiences to root for him, even when he's doing some questionable things. As for Tom Hardy as Jack Waterston. I think he was excellent as well. His portrayal of a manipulative and ruthless villain is just chilling. The supporting cast also did a great job in bringing their characters to life. Michelle Yeoh as the Russian crime boss, Natalie Byrne as the CIA agent, and Sam Hazeldine as Max Adams all contributed to making Mechanic Resurrection an enjoyable watch.
I have to agree with you there, Timothy. The casting was one of the strongest aspects of this film. Each actor brought something unique to their role that made the story more believable and engaging. Now let me ask you this. Do you think any particular character could have been improved upon or changed in some way?
Well, there are always room for improvements, but I don't think there were any glaring issues with the characters in Mechanic Resurrection.
However, if I had to choose one character that could have used more development, it would be Max Adams.
Played by Sam Hazeldine. He was a fascinating villain who had a very intriguing backstory, but we didn't get to see much of it on screen. A little more exploration into his character and motivations might have made him even more captivating than he already was.
That's an interesting point, Timothy. Max Adams is indeed a complex character with a lot of potential for depth. I also felt like there could have been more development in other areas, such as Gina's relationship with Arthur Bishop or Jack Waterston's motivations behind his actions. But overall, the characters were well written and well acted, which is what matters most in an action film.
Absolutely, Tom. The characters are the foundation of any good story in Mechanic. Resurrection did a commendable job bringing them to life on screen. Now that we've discussed the actors and their character, let me ask you this. Do you have any other thoughts or questions related to this topic before we move on to our next topic?
No further questions from me at this time, Timothy. But I must say it was quite interesting discussing the intricacies of Mechanic Resurrection with you. I'm looking forward to delving into our next topic and seeing where the conversation takes us.
I'm glad we could have such enlightening discussion, Thomas. Now let's move on to our next topic, which is about the cultural significance of Mechanic Resurrection. This film has a rather unique blend of action and thriller elements that appeal to a wide range of audiences. It also features an international setting, diverse cast, and complex characters which reflect the global nature of modern cinema. The film's storyline touches on themes like revenge, redemption, and the struggle for power, making it relevant to current socio-political issues.
That's an interesting perspective, Timothy. I hadn't thought about Mechanic Resurrection in such a light before. It does indeed tackle some complex themes that resonate with our current world. Additionally, the film's use of technology and high-tech gadgetry reflects our ever-growing reliance on technology in everyday life. The fact that the movie was shot in Bangkok, Thailand, also showcases the growing influence of Asian cinema on Hollywood blockbusters.
Yeah, Tom, you're right. The cultural significance of Mechanic Resurrection goes beyond just entertainment. It provides a mirror to our society and offers insights into the changing face of global cinema. But let me ask you this. Do you think this film will stand the test of time in terms of its cultural relevance, or will it become another forgotten action flick?
That's a tough question, Timothy. On one hand, Mechanic Resurrection has all the makings of a classic action film with its high-octane stunts and charismatic lead actor. On the other hand, the movie is very much a product of its time with its focus on technology and globalization. Only time will tell if it will be remembered as an iconic piece of cinema or simply another footnote in action film history.
I see your point, Tom. The cultural significance of any work of art is often determined by how well it reflects the times in which it was made and whether it continues to resonate with future generations. In the case of Mechanic Resurrection, only time can tell if it will become a classic or just another action flick from the 2010s.
Agreed, Ty. It's always fascinating to see how cultural trends and norms influence our understanding of art and cinema. Now let me ask you this. Do you have any other thoughts or questions related to the cultural significance of Mechanic? Resurrection before we move on to our next topic?
I think we've covered a lot of ground in our discussion about the cultural significance of Mechanic, Resurrection. But let me pose a question to you. Do you think this film could have been more successful if it had addressed some of these themes and issues in a more nuanced or subtle way? Or was its straightforward approach the best way to convey the message?
That's an interesting question, Timothy. I believe that Mechanic, Resurrection, did a good job at presenting complex themes without getting too bogged down by them. The film's focus on action and thrills allowed it to maintain its entertainment value while also addressing important issues like power, redemption, and globalization. However, I do think that some elements could have been explored in more depth, particularly the relationship between Arthur Bishop and Gina. But overall, I believe the movie struck a good balance between action and substance.
Yes, Tom, it's always a challenge to strike the right balance between entertainment and substance. And Mechanic, Resurrection, seems to have done a commendable job in that regard. Now that we've discussed the cultural significance of this film, let me ask you this. Do you have any other thoughts or questions related to this topic before we move on to our next subject?
No further questions from me at this time, Timothy. I think we've explored all aspects of Mechanic, Resurrection, that are worth discussing. Let's move on to the next topic and see where it takes us.
Well, Tom, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground when it comes to Mechanic, Resurrection. From its plot and characters to the cultural significance and our personal opinions on the film, it's been an interesting conversation, to say the least.
Yes, Timothy, I must agree with you there. We've delved deep into this film and discussed it from various angles, which is what makes film discussion so fascinating. It's always great to see how different people react differently to the same movie and share their thoughts and opinions.
Absolutely. Tom and I think that's why we enjoy doing these podcasts, to explore the world of cinema through the lens of our own personal experiences and perspectives. Now that we've discussed Mechanic, Resurrection, let me ask you this. What are your final thoughts on the film? Do you think it was a worthy addition to the franchise, or do you prefer its predecessor?
My final thoughts on Mechanic. Resurrection are somewhat mixed. While I appreciate the international setting and new characters introduced in this sequel, I feel that some of the action sequences were over the top and lacked realism. On the other hand, there are certain aspects of the original film that I miss in this one, its grittier tone and more grounded storyline. But ultimately, both films have their own unique charm and appeal to different audiences. As for which one I prefer between the two, well, it's a close call. But if I had to choose, I would go with the original Mechanic, simply because it feels more authentic and true to its genre. However, this doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy Mechanic. Resurrection, there were many aspects of the film that were quite enjoyable and made for an entertaining watch.
I see, Tom, your opinion on the matter is similar to mine. While I do think that Mechanic, Resurrection brought some freshness to the franchise with its international setting and new characters, it lacked the grittiness and realism of the original film. That said, both films are worth watching for different reasons, and each has something unique to offer audiences. Now that we've shared our final thoughts on Mechanic, Resurrection, let's wrap up this episode with an outro. Thank you so much for joining us today, as always. It's been a pleasure discussing this film with you, Tom. Until next time, remember to keep watching those movies and supporting independent content creators like ourselves.
Agreed, Tim. It's been a great conversation as usual, and I look forward to our next podcast where we will discuss another exciting film. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and leave us your thoughts in the comments section below. See you soon on the next episode of Tim and Tom's Film Nights.